You came a long way from St. Louis. You climbed the ladder of success. I've seen the flashy foreign cars that were parked out in front of your fancy address. You came a long way from St. Louis. You broke a lot of hearts between.
And right back at you here on the Radioactive Take with me, Bryan Styble, longtime commercial news talk radio host, now doing the YouTube thing, and so delighted to have you in the audience. Thank you for being there. And we'll try to make it worth your narrowcast's while as we kick around the culture and offer news and commentary, old school style, from Xanadu here in Florida. And as we like to do on the Radioactive Take, let's first take a glance across the American landscape and see what's on the minds of the Republic in the form of comments about the headlines here on the 5th of September. And no, that's not Nilsson, Harry Nilsson, but it is the Fred Neil song that was taken to the top of the charts, I believe back in 1969, the top of the charts on AM radio like WBQS. We're an AM band kind of thing here on this news and commentary narrowcast. And we've got some thoughts about Harry Nilsson, but not for this edition of the Radioactive Take. No, instead we're, everybody's talking, and now the burners themselves have a chance to talk about what happened there in the northwestern desert of Nevada. And they're saying the media got it all wrong. Just more sensationalism. I read 200 or 300, maybe even 400 comments of mostly burners, or a lot of them, on Yahoo. They were commenting on the coverage, and they're saying, no, the media got it wrong. Sure, there was rain, but there was rain at Woodstock, too. There was mud. There was mud at Woodstock, too. And yeah, there was a long line, 5, 6, 7 miles of cars bumper to bumper with all of those RVs waiting to get out. Yeah, it was a struggle, but not nearly like it was portrayed in the various news accounts. You saw the footage. And I'm glad to hear that most of the revelers enjoyed themselves and didn't regret making the trek out to the desert there with all of the dust and soon enough mud from something like 12 hours solid of rain that complicated things considerably for the folks taking in Burning Man 2023. Turns out to be another stiff sentence for another Proud Boy in the aftermath of the fiasco known as January 6th, 2021. And we can only say good luck behind bars. It's going to be a long stretch for you there, deserved or not. That's a judgment you can make. I'm not going to offer any thoughts on that here. We're also looking at what they're calling soon to be Hurricane Lee, L-E-E, as in Robert E., or, dare I say, as in Bryan Lee Styble, because that was my birth name, spelled differently than this Styble, if we can point directly at it there. Never figured this out yet. As I've pointed out, the weather guys on TV, and I've worked with a number of them over the years, worked at 4 TV stations, and the weathermen and weather women know how to do the reverse image thing in a way that I haven't yet mastered and probably never will on the narrowcast, I got to admit. I'm used to looking in a mirror like you are. But But anyway, no, I was born with the middle name Lee and never liked it. And therefore, when I changed my name legally to my stage name, Bryan Styble, I deleted the middle name. And no, I'm not going to tell you what the Q in BQS stands for. Well, up here it's just a call letter. WBQS, News Talk Radio. But what it stands for, we will leave for you to guess here on the narrowcast. But anyway, this possible Hurricane Lee that's now a tropical depression gaining strength over the warm Atlantic, the warm waters of the Atlantic this summer. It is heading not for Florida, it doesn't look like. It's heading for points further north, if it ever makes landfall in the United States at all. It'll be hitting, they think, maybe Virginia, maybe even up as far north as New Jersey and Long Island. We'll see how that goes. On the other hand, it just may pummel Bermuda if it takes a right-hand turn. So we'll then, in that case, let the folks wearing the Bermuda shorts deal with it. Or it could fizzle. These things sometimes peter out as quickly as they gather strength. So who knows? The meteorologists will track it for us, and whoever's in the line of fire will have to deal with it if it develops into anything. First Lady Jill Biden's COVID thing has developed into a second bout with it, and we're told the symptoms are minimal, and that's good news, and she's recovering in one of my favorite states, the first state it's known as, because it was the first state to ratify the Constitution, and that's why it was the first state quarter issued. Delaware's was. She's up there in Delaware, but not at their home in Wilmington. The Bidens apparently have another place at the ocean in Delaware, and that's where she's recovering, and we wish her best of luck as that progresses or fades, we hope. That said, let us now pivot and talk about a name that you may not have heard in quite a few years, but I know you'll be familiar with it as I take another draw of the vape. Huey Newton, often phrased as Huey P. Newton. P for Percy was the middle name. He was one of the founders, and certainly the most important founder of the Black Panthers. And as you may remember, I certainly do. I remember when the story broke back in 1989, shortly after he met his maker, Huey Newton did, on Tuesday, August 22nd, 1989. I think it was the next day when the story broke, or at least that I read it. And I distinctly remember not mourning his passing. Now, I'm not going to tell you that I celebrated his passing. I don't do that. And for the very good reason that dear old Mom back in St. Louis warned me early in life, and I never forgot it. I couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 or 8 years old after I said something stupid, and it was involving somebody's death. And Mom said, "Don't you ever, ever wish death on anybody." And pretty much from that moment, I haven't. I don't even wish death on people who deserve to die. And we do have that sort of individual in our society from time to time, mass murderers, terrorists, and what have you. Sometimes these people have to die in order to prevent more mayhem from going down. But I never celebrate the death of a perp, no matter what he did. And I distinguish myself from Dennis Prager, who we cite on the Radioactive Take from time to time. He does celebrate the death of mass murderers. In fact, he says, I wish instead of being arrested, that mass murderer would have just been killed on the spot. I can't get behind that kind of an idea, in part because of what Mom said, and also just because it's just bad karma to wish death on anyone, even those deserving of it. So I wasn't celebrating the death of Huey Newton back in 1989, but I'm here to apologize, a third of a century tardy, admittedly, but apologize nonetheless, ladies and gentlemen, for not mourning in 1989 the death of Huey P. Newton. And I'll explain why in a few moments, but not before we lubricate the throat one more time, lest my voice go south on me as it has on previous editions of the Radioactive Take. But first I should explain why I've been thinking of Huey Newton recently. It is all as a result of something that YouTube, on another channel, competing with WPQS News Talk Radio, on another channel of YouTube, I was offered an old firing line from 1971, wherein he was, for the full hour, interrogated. Interviewed is not strong enough a word to describe what William F. Buckley Jr. was doing to him there, because as you know, as everybody remembers, Buckley was no liberal. He was a solid conservative. Some would say he's the father of the modern conservative movement in America, along with Barry Goldwater, perhaps. But he was interrogating him, Buckley was, back in 1971. And Huey Newton, on this edition of Firing Line, was not putting his best foot forward rhetorically. Now, I'm not telling you he was inarticulate. He was a very smart man, eventually earned a doctorate, as a matter of fact. Dr. Huey Newton. But he wasn't making a good case for his defense of the behavior of his comrades in the Black Panthers there in the San Francisco Bay Area in general and in Oakland in particular. He was long identified with Oakland. And in fact, that's where he died on the 22nd of August, 1989, at the hands of a gunman. And you could even say, even though it looked to onlookers, and I believe there were some witnesses, it looked to onlookers like it was just another murder in the streets of Oakland, and there's more than enough of them in that city that I have a personal history with. A number of very interesting things have happened to me in the city of Oakland, California, not just the Bay Area, but Oakland in particular. And we'll get to them on future editions of the Radioactive Take, I'm confident. But I was never identified with the city. Huey Newton was and died there. And again, depending on how you look at the facts, you could even say he was assassinated there, because the gunman later told police that it was retribution for some infighting going on in the radical left community in Oakland. So maybe it was an assassination. It was certainly a murder. And I was, when I got the news back in 1989, again, I was not in mourning over it, because I was familiar with the history of the Black Panthers in general and Huey Newton in particular. And in fact, he was a rather violent guy in his earlier years. He was convicted and I believe served time. There was more than one trial, and there was an overturning of the verdict, and I believe he was later again convicted of the killing of a cop, but not for murder. The charge and the conviction was for voluntary manslaughter, which sounds like murder, but has the additional consideration that emotions were running so high that the jury saw some, I don't want to say justification, but at least they understood how it could have snowballed into a situation where the cop was killed, as he was. And Newton, again, stood trial for it more than once. And there was another case where he was implicated in, I believe, a couple of deaths, never charged, but he was a violent guy early on, as were many of the Black Panthers. And that's part of the reason I was not mourning his passing back in 1989. But I'm here to tell you, in 2023, I owe him a posthumous apology. And that's what this segment of the Radioactive Take is all about here in 2023. By the way, let's put it in context, what was happening the week he was killed. He was killed on a Tuesday, my favorite day of the week, August 22nd, 1989. And 2 days prior, on Sunday night, a story that made enormous headlines, got enormous coverage in Los Angeles, but wasn't quite yet a national story, that being the death of the Menendezes, killed by their two sons with shotguns while they were watching a movie in Beverly Hills in their very nice home. I've driven past the place. You can too. It's something of a infamous landmark in Los Angeles. But it wasn't until later that it became clear that the kids were the ones that did it. And we all remember those two trials they had. I guess the first one was a mistrial, and then they were later convicted in a trial that wasn't televised, and that may have had a lot to do with how they were convicted in the second trial. But that week there was no inkling. Might have been some rumors, but there was no inkling in the couple of days aftermath of that horrific double murder, patricide in Beverly Hills. There was no indication, no suggestion, no suspicion hardly that the kids were responsible. That came out much later. But it was a big story, if not a national story. It was a huge story locally that week, and I was in Los Angeles. That's where I was when I learned about the killing of Huey Newton. And then 3 days after Newton was killed was something that we all remember. I'm talking about the flyby of Voyager 2 of Neptune, the blue planet. What in those days was considered the 8th of 9 planets, but that was before Pluto was demoted to minor planet status. I guess they call them dwarf planets. And now it's the last of the so-called planets, Neptune is. And it's the only time any spacecraft has ever gotten anywhere near Neptune. So all of the pictures you see, close-ups you see of Neptune and all of its many moons, and it's got a lot of them, just like Uranus and Saturn and Jeopardy. How about Jupiter? Getting my J's conflated there. They all have a lot of planets, and we didn't see any of them up close until that one day, which I guess would have been the 25th of August, 3 days after Newton died, that we saw all the pictures being beamed back from Voyager 2. And for those of us interested in astronomy, and we do cover everything from astronomy to zoology over WBQS News Talk Radio, a fictive radio station that ought to exist, at least in my mind it does. Anyway, that's the context in which the passing of Huey Newton happened back in 1989. And by the way, again, what made me think about Newton was something YouTube threw at me, this interview with William F. Buckley Jr. on Firing Line. But in researching him, I found out what I'd never known previously. I've been hearing him called Huey P. Newton more often than Huey Newton over the years. Never knew what the P stood for. It stood for Percy. But more to the point, or more interesting to me as a student of American assassinations, was the fact that Huey Newton, a child of rural Louisiana, was named after the kingfish. I'm talking about Huey Long. Now, you may not remember the name Huey Long, but If so, it's because you didn't pay attention in high school. I'm sure any American history class of any worth would at some point describe Huey Newton, because Huey Long, senator and governor of Louisiana, and a rival of FDR's. He was going to run in 1936. It was widely believed, Huey Long was, the kingfish. He was going to run against FDR and try to wrest the Democrat nomination from President Roosevelt in 1936. But he never got the chance because Dr. Weiss killed him in an ambush in the state capital of Baton Rouge in 1935. That happened on, the shooting was on Sunday night, and they killed the gunman, Dr. Weiss, immediately. The bodyguards of the Kingfish did. But Huey Long, red-headed fellow, and quite a speaker. There's a big statue of him right out in front of the state capitol in Baton Rouge, and rightfully so. He's, I guess, the most celebrated politician in Louisiana's history. And he held on for 2 days. And I believe, I didn't look this up, but I think I can quote it. I believe his last words were, "But I have so much more to do." But he never got the chance, because he died then on the 10th of September, 1935, and never went up against FDR at the Democrat convention in 36. So that was it for Huey Long. And by the way, if you want to see a fictive version of Huey Long, there's a terrific film, won all kinds of awards. It may have even won Best Picture Oscar. I'm talking about All the King's Men, where Broderick Crawford plays a character named Willie Stark. But just as everybody knew that Citizen Kane was about not Charles Foster Kane, although the movie was, everybody knew that Citizen Kane, from Xanadu, spelled with an X in Citizen Kane's case, everybody knew that Citizen Kane was a cinematic doppelganger, if you will, of William Randolph Hearst, the publisher. Everybody knew that. That's what they call a roman à clef, which looks in print like it's a roman à clef, but it's pronounced, I do believe, I believe it's a French phrase. Roman à clef is when you have a fictional narrative, but it's based on a real-life person, and it's very thinly disguised. That's a roman à clef, and All the King's Men was a roman à clef regarding Huey Long in the form of the fictive character Willie Stark, played by Broderick Crawford. And it was, by most accounts, the pinnacle of Broderick Crawford's career. And he had a great career, and he's in a whole pile of terrific, if obscure, film noir productions that we like to talk about here on the Radioactive Take. And I know that Broderick Crawford is most remembered for Highway Patrol, 10-4, but that was on television, and television is not to be compared with cinema, at least not when cinema's done well, and All the King's Men was done well. So let's hear it for Broderick Crawford's, I think, crowning achievement of his career. And it was also a great film for Mercedes McCambridge, who didn't make a lot of movies, but was prominently featured in that one. But anyway, we're not here to tell you on this edition of the Radioactive Take about Huey Long, the assassinated, very possible threat to FDR in the 1930s. We're here to talk about his namesake, Huey Newton, who I did not mourn when I read his obituary in 1989. But I'm here to tell you in 2023, a third of a century too late perhaps, but better late than never. But better never late, as somebody once pointed out to me. But it is better late than never, I suppose, that I apologize to the late Mr. Newton for not mourning your death, especially since you were killed. And again, it may have been an assassination because there were some political connections. And I don't know that the gunman personally knew him, but the gunman was like Huey Newton and so many other Black Panthers in Oakland. They were all part of the same radical leftist militant scene. So there may have been a political element to it. And that's what makes a murder an assassination. And that's why, by the way, I say that John Lennon wasn't merely murdered, he was assassinated. Now you might say, well, he was a musician, a rock and roller. What's the political connection? Well, if it would have been Paul McCartney, and thank heavens it wasn't, but if it would have been Paul McCartney, then it would have been a murder, because Paul McCartney, except for a handful of tunes, like Give Ireland Back to the Irish, I suppose, except for a handful of tunes, McCartney is not a political artist. And by the way, I think that's to his credit. I don't particularly like it when a recording artist becomes political for reasons that we could explain and probably will on some future edition of the Radioactive take. But suffice it to say that the Lennon thing was an assassination because Lennon was very politically identified, not just in his music, but he had that business with his immigration problem. Nixon's people were trying to get him out of the country based on an old marijuana charge from England years earlier, as I recall. So the Lennon thing was an assassination, not merely a murder. And the Huey Newton murder was arguably an assassination. But whichever it was, I should have mourned his passing back in 1989. But I didn't, because I knew only about his background with the Black Panthers. And I also knew something about his violent background, so I thought, well, again, I didn't celebrate his death. Mom was right. You don't celebrate anybody's death, even if they deserve to die. But I also didn't mourn it. But I'm mourning it now. And the reason I'm mourning it now is because something that YouTube threw at me. They offered me this Bill Buckley firing line from 1971 when Newton did not defend the left well at all. And at some point, Buckley said, well, excuse me, Mr. Newton, I have no idea what you're talking about, and frankly, I don't think you do either. Now, that's a lousy impression of William F. Buckley, Jr. We can agree on that. But he did say that to him, and I think Buckley was right. But I have been selling Huey Newton short for decades because just this week, after I watched the firing line interview where he didn't behave, well, he behaved himself. He was polite, and he was actually good-humored, smiling a lot and cracking a joke here and there, much atypical of the image that I had, and maybe you have as well, of the Black Panthers as a collective. But again, he didn't defend his actions that Buckley was probing him about well on that edition of Firing Line. But now flash forward to 1988 and 89 when he was sitting down for a series of interviews, maybe with PBS, maybe with something else. It was a number of interviews, and at one point they even retake one of them and bring out the old clapboard and do this. Okay, Huey Newton interview, take 3. You know, that kind of thing. In this interview, to say he had cleaned up his act is an understatement. First of all, he looked clean cut, much more so than the disheveled Bryan Styble on camera here on the narrowcast over WBQS in 2023. He was wearing a Brooks Brothers style suit, nice haircut, and a very handsome man he was as well. Plus, and this was evident throughout the interview on Firing Line, as well as this later interview, he spoke with a very interesting lilt. He was a learned man. He had attained a doctorate in some discipline eventually, and knew how to carry himself, and came off as gentlemanly and as thoughtfully as anybody could hope to on camera in this series of interviews he was doing about a year before he was killed. And in this interview, he was making a much stronger case for his actions with the Black Panthers back in their glory days, back in the 60s and 70s. And what a lot of people don't realize about the Black Panthers, same thing they don't realize about Hamas. Everybody knows about Hamas's suicide bombers and all the rest, and how they run or mismanage the affairs of the folks living under their domain in the on the Gaza Strip there in the Middle East. But what people don't realize about Hamas is they have a wide range of social programs, health benefits, food banks, and the like for the needy in the Gaza Strip there, in addition to their tutorials on suicide bombing that I'm sure that they also engage in. But just as Hamas doesn't get that good press, so do the Black Panthers never get or seldom get credit for the good they do. And he was highlighting a lot of this, and good for him and good for the people of Oakland. When Newton described this in this latter set of interviews he was doing for whoever he was doing it for. And all of these interviews that I'm talking about can be seen right here on YouTube. So they're on a competing channel, and I wouldn't invite you to tune away from WBQS News Talk Radio just yet. But they're worth looking for to get another side of the late Huey Newton. And again, I was so impressed by this long-form interview. It lasted longer in all of its segments in toto than did Buckley's interrogation on Firing Line. And I came away really regretting not mourning his passing back in 1989 when I read about it. And that's why I'm apologizing. Well, I can't apologize to him anymore, but I can apologize to the narrowcast viewership for taking so long, so many years to catch up with the better side, if you will, of Huey Newton. So that's why I'm apologizing to him here on the Radioactive Take. And I've got some other thoughts about my bipartisanship. I'm a centrist, if you haven't figured that out by now, over the month we've been doing the Radioactive Take. Well, let me, as a coda, as a closing thought on this edition of the Radioactive Take, let me prove to you how bipartisan a guy I am by telling you a couple of the names I voted for in November of 1984. I was living in Los Angeles at the time, and on the west side of LA, in a neighborhood or a district known as Mar Vista. We've talked about that on a previous edition of the Radioactive Take, maybe in a couple of them. And Mar Vista happens to be part of the assembly district of a certain assemblyman. Out in California, they don't have a state House of Representatives. They do, but they call it the state assembly. They have a state Senate, and they have a state House of Representatives that's known as the Assembly. And there is a well-known, now he's late, died a couple of years ago, I guess. There's a late state assemblyman that I voted for in 1984, the very same night I voted for Ronald Reagan to be reelected as president, as he was, 49? He won 49 states Either 80 or 84, and he won 44 states, I think, the other one, but I can't remember which just offhand. I should have looked that up beforehand, but you can't do everything in show prep. But anyway, back in 1984, election night, the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. And we've covered that previously on the Radioactive Take. A lot of people erroneously think, because they didn't pay attention in civics class. I took it in 9th grade back in St. Louis. You may have taken it in 10th or 8th. But whenever you took it, they told you at some point, I hope they told you, that Election Day in America is not the first Tuesday in November. That's a myth. It's the first Tuesday after the first Monday, which means it's never earlier than November 2nd and never later than November 8th. Can't remember which day of November it was in 1984, but I voted for Reagan, and I voted because I was a resident of Mar Vista, which included his assembly district. I voted for Tom Hayden as my assemblyman in Sacramento. Tom Hayden, late of the Chicago 7. He was one of the Chicago 7 defendants. Tom Hayden, one of the founders and certainly the most prominent member of the Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, as lefty an organization as we've ever seen. And, not incidentally, Tom Hayden, Mr. Jane Fonda. That's right. He was married to Hanoi Jane at the time. Well, I don't call her that, but everybody else does. And I even met, I met Hayden back at Boston University. He made an address there about I think it was my sophomore year. So that would have been 75, I guess. But then I ran into him at a couple of Democrat Party functions. I was involved with a woman who was involved with Democrat Party politics on the west side of Los Angeles there, and Fonda and Hayden showed up in tandem a couple of times, and I said hello. Wanted to see if he remembered me from Boston University, which he didn't. But anyway, that's not why I voted for him, Bo. No, I voted for him because I'm a bipartisan kind of guy. I'm a centrist politically. And yeah, we don't get a lot into politics on the Radioactive Take because we care, at least on this narrowcast, more about the culture than we do about ideology. But again, is there anything I could say to you that would better solidify my credentials as a centrist than voting for rock-rib conservative President Reagan and leftist Chicago 7 defendant Tom Hayden on the same ballot? I think not. So that'll give you a little bit of an inkling as to where we stand ideologically, but I'm more interested in how I stand intellectually, because we do discuss everything from astronomy to zoology, or Aristotle to Zoroastrianism, here on the Narrowcast. And we hope we've given you reason to find us again later in the week, maybe even tomorrow, when we reconvene this little narrowcast we call the Radioactive Take. And I'm pointing in the wrong direction because I've never figured out how to get all... See, the weather guys on television and weather gals, I've worked at 4 TV stations, and I always marveled at how they're able to do the reverse thing. I can't do it yet, and I got a hunch I'm never going to get that down. Because, I remind you, I'm a radio guy, not a television guy. But we'll figure out sooner or later how to point to the right spot here. See, we can go all over with the pointers and eventually get to it, but not after you're laughing on the other side of the YouTube camera. Can't this guy get it together? Well, not when it comes to the niceties of television work, because again, I'm a radio guy, and that's why we're over WBQS News Talk Radio, as we will be again for the Wednesday edition of the Narrowcast tomorrow. In the meantime, if you want to send us some email, there, we got the pointing thing down, radioactiveseattle@gmail.com. And you might even consider, if you gotten any useful information out of the last few minutes here on the Narrowcast, you might give us a thumbs up indicating you like it, and you might even subscribe, because that's how I am informed, grow an audience. We've got a minuscule audience. That's why it's a narrowcast. And even if I had thousands of people, it would still be a narrowcast compared to the commercial news talk radio broadcasts I did over the years, where, at least at the heritage stations, I had tens of thousands of people tuned in. But here, it's a narrowcast. But even if I only had an audience of one, and some of these, I suppose, may only generate one viewer, but that's okay. That's still an audience, and that's why we do it. We do it for you in the YouTube audience, and we hope that you'll be here tomorrow when we once again, from Xanadu, offer news and commentary old school style. In the meantime, I offer you a left-handed salute from Florida.